It is the worst manifestation of what people can do to other people.
They would strip naked the girls, they would take their IDs, they would beat them.
M-am dat drept client, am luat-o, am sequestrat-o și am vândut-o la...
So I'm really gonna have to die before I get to go home now.
When he beat me, I go off the floor and I do that.
We give these kids scars for the rest of their life.
And they forced us, the 30 of us, to beat this girl to death.
Convicting 3,000 people around the world every year isn't enough. Freeing 40,000 or so victims a year isn't enough.
I describe it as a slave-like practices, which is being mentored on these young, unfortunate children.
24 hours all day. There's no break, and I was cleaning too and cooking, doing everything.
Poor families have to work all together. You see that all around the world. But when you exploit them, when you beat them, when you threaten them, we're in trouble.
We get in the first truck and the guy decides he wants me. And I started to just think that maybe I deserve this for doing this to myself.
You feel like you're not even a person.
Good evening, everyone. What you have just seen is a trailer from a documentary film called Not My Life. Not My Life is the first film to depict the cruel and dehumanizing practices of human trafficking and modern slavery on a global scale. Last week, through the support of one of our sponsors for this evening's event, we screened this film. And for those of you who have additional interest in the topic that will be covered by tonight's speaker, we will again be screening the full-length version of Not My Life next Tuesday, April the 8th, at 7 o'clock here on campus in the Cataldo Hall Globe Room. I want to take this opportunity first and foremost to welcome all of you to tonight's event. Thank you for joining us as we in turn welcome our guest speaker, who tonight will speak to us on a topic about which he has become well-versed due to his many years of committed research and investigation of it. The work of tonight's speaker, Professor Siddharth Kara, unveils the immense social curtain that hides the misery and the horror that is experienced by literally millions around the globe who are in bondage, who are enslaved, including some that live within our own community. Professor Kara is a leading expert in the field of human trafficking and modern slavery. He has documented over 1,300 cases in more than 30 countries. In addition to the research that he conducts, he is a teacher at Harvard University, and he advises a number of governments on anti-trafficking policy and law, and has to date published 2 books, Bonded Labor and Sex Trafficking Inside the Business of Modern Slavery. Opportunities like the one in which we are engaged tonight, of exploring provocative and important issues, is a significant part of the work that we at Gonzaga do. which seeks to provide opportunities for thought leaders like Professor Kara to come and to indeed be part of the educational experience that we provide to our students and to the broader community. In asking Professor Kara to come here, it was my desire that he be able to provide us with an in-view into the research that he personally has conducted and to help us all better understand, become better informed about this issue and the dynamics that underlie it. I do in a particular way hope that our students will have an opportunity to understand and to come to know Professor Kara's personal journey, which in its own way reflects a movement away from one career and set of chosen experiences into a very different sphere that required courage and very intensive work, a tremendous commitment, and a great deal of sacrifice, utilizing all that he had learned through his educational experiences to bring them to bear in the cause of serving humanity. I want to express tonight, in particular, my gratitude to all of those who have in various ways invested in the success of tonight's event. In particular, I want to thank our faculty and our staff, the Gonzaga Student Body Association for its support, our Board of Trustees and our Board of Regents, and our sponsors, Washington Trust Bank and World Relief of Spokane. Would you please, in particular, join me in thanking the major sponsors who have made this event possible tonight? As has been our tradition, at the conclusion of tonight's program, Professor Kara will autograph books and be available to meet those who wish to meet him for a limited time up in the South Concourse. His books are available for purchase in the East Lobby, and as a courtesy to Professor Kara, and especially to fellow audience members, we want everyone to fully enjoy the program and would ask that you not use flash photography and that you please silence mobile phones and electronic devices so that everybody can listen comfortably and hear what Professor Kara has to bring to us tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the stage our spring 2014 presidential speaker, the author and researcher, Professor Siddharth Kara.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Good evening. I'd first like to thank President McCullough for that very warm and kind introduction, and thank also the faculty and staff of Gonzaga University, the supporters of this event, and indeed all of you for being here tonight. I've been very touched and humbled by how warmly I've been received, and I'm really very honored and happy to be here. President McCullough has asked me to talk to you tonight about human trafficking and modern slavery, and in particular, my own personal journey to this issue, and some of the human faces and voices that I've documented in the course of my research. And interspersed with that, I'd like to also give you a little bit of scholarly grounding in this issue so that hopefully you come away with a little bit more knowledge both in the mind and a little bit more feeling in the heart. And perhaps some of you might be motivated to contribute to combating this issue around the world by the end of this evening. I will never forget the very first trafficked sex slave I met. She was 14 years old in a brothel in Bombay and was being brutalized by numerous men, grown men, each and every day. Though her heart was still beating, she looked to me as if she were already dead. She was poor, illiterate, had lost all hope. In many ways, she was the face of contemporary civilization's greatest shame, the failure to protect our children from brutal enslavement. That encounter was 14 years ago and thousands of miles from here. It was one of the pivotal experiences that convinced me I had to devote my life to combating modern slavery. Since that time, my research has continued around the world, spanning numerous modes of servitude and countless women, men, and children exploited in dozens of industries, from sex to labor to the harvesting of organs. To frame my remarks this evening, I'd like to share with you the story of another young girl that I met just last summer right here in the United States. Her name is Maria, and she reminded me very much of that first child slave I met in Bombay. Petite, soft-spoken, emptiness in her eyes. She was from a small town in the Chiapas state of Mexico, 17 years old when I met her, and had been recruited to leave her home with the promise of a job working as a cleaning lady in office buildings in the United States. This is some of what she told me, portions of which I will edit given that there are some younger people in the audience today. I traveled with the agent from my home to Nuevo Laredo. At Nuevo Laredo, the agent left me in a small house with more than 60 other people who wanted to cross the border. Those people were mostly from Mexico, Guatemala, and El Salvador. There were also some men from Nepal. We were locked inside that house, and the coyotes, these are people who take you across the border, told us we had to pay $800 to the cartel or they would not take us. I did not have this money, so they said I could repay the fee once I was working in the United States. The cartel soldiers came sometime and took some of the men from the home, and we never saw them again. They threatened to kill us, and they attacked some of the women. After a long time, the coyotes took us across the border in the middle of the day. They sent us with some other men to the US side. These men took us to a house. Eventually, they took me and two other girls who were from El Salvador to San Diego. In San Diego, I was locked inside a house like a brothel, and the men in that house attacked me for 2 weeks. I tried to protest, but they would attack me until I was unconscious. After that, they forced me to take customers at night. Sometimes it was only 4 or 5 men in a night. Sometimes it was 20. They forced me to do unnatural things. The pimp would beat me if I did not please the customers. I had a broken rib once, but it did not matter how much pain I was in. The pimp forced me to be with customers. When I became pregnant, they made me have an abortion, even though this was against my belief. Every day I prayed, someone will help me. Where I am from, we dreamed to come to America, but I did not know it was such a bad place. I had never been with a man before San Diego. Those men hurt me so much. I hated that place. I knew God had sent me to hell, but I did not understand why. Maria's is one of the millions of voices of modern-day slavery. From Bombay to San Diego, the slaves I have met speak of archaic modes of exploitation and barbarism that have evolved in the era of the global economy with brutal efficiency. These slaves suffer in the dark underbelly of globalization, at the bottom of the supply chain, a class of human beings who are literally chewed up in the name of profit. In my short time tonight, I would like to try to frame this phenomenon for you, give it some historic context, unpack its economic logic, and suggest some basic steps on how we might tackle this issue. So where did it all begin for me? Well, it started a little more than 20 years ago in this refugee camp in Bosnia. Those are the barracks, old military barracks you can see in the back where we stayed with the refugees, and these are some of the refugees who I met and who became my friends. I was an undergraduate at the time, not much older than any of the students who are in this room now. And this was the early 1990s. And as some of you may recall, the former Yugoslavia was completely falling apart at that time. A lot of violence, genocide, and suffering. So being young and having energy and idealism, I thought, I'm going to go and make a difference. And I did go, and I did get a placement in a refugee camp, this one here, filled with Bosnian Muslims. I don't think I made too much of a difference. I did listen. I listened to the stories that these refugees and others told me of what had happened to them, the suffering, the genocide, the invasion, the violence drawn along ethnic lines. And I heard some stories that would draw me to this issue one day. Women, in fact, these two here, told me of stories of Serbian soldiers that would go into Bosnian villages, execute the men, round up the women and children, and traffic the young women and girls to rape camps and brothels across the Balkans and beyond that to Western Europe. Now, as I said, I was fairly young at that time and really didn't know how to process what I was experiencing or hearing. I came back, I finished my degree, I went on and studied law and got an MBA and was working as an investment banker in New York in the late 1990s. And I started to reflect at that point in my life, what am I going to do with myself? How am I going to be most positive and useful to the world? I can sit here on Wall Street and certainly generate a nice income for myself, but what will I be giving back to the world? So I reflected on this summer and I thought to myself, are these things still happening? And if they are, is anything being done about it? And I looked around, and in the late 1990s, I didn't really see much of anything being done about it. And in fact, these things were still happening, and there really wasn't much research going on. Well, I decided to make a radical shift in my life. I forewent the corporate path, and I thought, let me go out into the world, look into this issue, and see if I can make a difference. And I will tell you candidly, I thought to myself, I will probably realize this is far too complicated for someone like me. Smarter people need to deal with this. I will come back and have a normal life. It went completely the other way. I spent 4 months in Asia that summer, the summer of 2000, and was completely overwhelmed and consumed by what I saw, what I witnessed, what I heard, the suffering, the pain, the exploitation, the greed, but also the courage, the nobility, the grace of those who are fighting these issues or who had suffered them and come through the other side with a positive spirit. And I realized I needed to do something more about this and that there was research that could be done. I saw in front of me an immense global economic crime. It is fundamentally a violation of human rights, but at the end of the day, these people are being exploited for profit. And if I could understand that economics, model it, track it, trace it, maybe I could make an argument as to what we should do about it. And that began what is now 14 years of traveling around the world, doing research firsthand, and of course writing, publishing, and advocating on this issue. So what have I learned? What have I learned in all this time? Well, to start to describe what I've learned, I'd like to just go back in history a little bit, to this building right here. This is one of the first slave trading posts built by Europeans on the West African coast. Now it has a new roof and has been refurbished since 1502, but the structure is still the same. I spent a month in Nigeria actually researching some of the most horrific human trafficking stories you'll ever hear, and I'll talk about them later. But one of the places I went to is this town called Badagry, and this slave trading post that was built by the Portuguese more than 500 years ago. Africans from across the northern part of the continent were brought into this building here, locked in chains, then later taken out to the beach, which was called the Point of No Return. They were taken in canoes out into large seafaring vessels and ultimately trafficked taken in ships across the Atlantic and then sold into slavery in the Americas. And we here in this country know this story. We know this story pretty well because many of those slaves were sold into plantation work in North America. At the same time, it's much less known that many of these slaves were being trafficked the other way as well, into Asia. And that Asian slave trade has gotten much less attention, even though the numbers are even greater. And this is something I talk about in my second book. But how does this issue and Badagry and all of these slaves who are trafficked relate to what's going on today? I'm going to answer that question by reading to you two brief narratives that I think will give you a really good sense of how past has informed present and how slavery has evolved across time. The first narrative I want to read to you, just very briefly, is from a book I would encourage all of you to read. The interesting narrative of the life of Oluwada Ekwano. Oluwada Ekwano was born in the Benin Empire of Nigeria, not far from that slave trading post in Badagry. He was sold into a slave ship and enslaved in the Americas for many years on a plantation in Virginia, before he ultimately got his freedom and then wrote down his story and became a leading figure in the anti-slavery movement of the 18th century. The second narrative I'll read briefly is from someone I call Mustafa, and he was a human trafficking victim from Bangladesh that I documented just 2 years ago. So just listen and compare in your minds what you hear. The first from Ekwano. The first object which saluted my eyes when I arrived on the coast was the sea and a slave ship, which was then riding at anchor and waiting for its cargo. These filled me with astonishment, which was soon converted into terror when I was carried on board. I was immediately handled and tossed up to see if I were found by some of the crew, and I was now persuaded that I was gotten into a world of bad spirits and that they were going to kill me. Their complexions, too, differing so much from ours, and their long hair, and the language they spoke, which was so different from any I had ever heard, united to confirm me in this belief. Indeed, such were the horrors of my views and fears at the moment that if 10,000 worlds had been my own, I would have freely parted with them, all to have exchanged my condition with that of the meanest slave in my own country. At last, when the ship we were in had got all her cargo, they made ready with many fearful noises, and we were all put under deck so that we could not see how they managed the vessel. But this disappointment was the least of my sorrow. The stench of the hold we were on the coast was so intolerably loathsome that it was dangerous to remain there for any time, and some of us had been permitted to stay on deck for fresh air. But now that the whole ship's cargo were confined together, it became absolutely pestilential. The closeness of the place and the heat of the climate, added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. This produced copious perspirations, so that the air soon became unfit for respiration. This wretched situation was aggravated by the galling of the chains, now become insupportable, and the filth of the necessary tubs into which the children often fell and were almost suffocated. The shrieks of the women, the groans of the dying, rendered the whole scene a horror almost inconceivable. This, the reality of the millions of Africans trafficked into slavery in the Americas, including here. Now, Mustafa. My name is Mustafa. I am from the Khulna district of Bangladesh. We are very poor, and it is very difficult to find work. Many recruiters come to our village. They promise they can arrange us work in construction in other countries for very good wages. First, we have to pay a fee of 4 lakh taka, that's around $5,000, for the training and documents. I did not have these funds, so I took a loan, which they said I could repay from my wages once I was working. After some months, we were given our documents, and the agents arranged travel for us by ship to Kuala Lumpur. The ship left from Mongala port. More than 20 of us were put inside a container in the bottom of the ship. It was dark, but we were provided torches. We were only allowed out of the container in the late night for maybe 1 hour for toilet. Otherwise, we had to stay inside the container all the time. It was very hot and the smell was very bad. We tried to wait for toilet when we were allowed outside, but if we had to go otherwise, we could only use a bucket inside the container. Most of us became very sick and were vomiting. I think it was maybe 9 days for us to reach Kuala Lumpur. From there, we were taken to dormitories with hundreds of men. We slept mostly on mats on the ground. Each morning at 4, we were taken to the construction sites by bus. My work was with cement. We had to usually work till 7 or 8 at night. If we did not work hard enough, the bosses would beat us. We had to ask permission to urinate, or they would beat us. We were given only 2 meals a day, then we were taken back inside the dormitory. I did this work for 7 months, and I did not receive any wage. Eventually, the police arrested me, and I was deported. So you've heard an old world slavery story and a new world slavery or human trafficking story. And you've heard a few similarities, but also some very fundamental differences. And this slide here, if you remember just one thing from tonight, I'd like you to remember this slide here, because this one slide will capture for you the transformation and evolution of slavery and trafficking across the centuries and why it has become such a compelling and pervasive phenomenon in modern times. So, old world and today. In the old world, we had lengthy, expensive journeys, weeks at sea. Now, Mustafa was also in a ship for a few days, but most people can be transported very quickly around the world for a very small cost. Today, in the old world, there was limited avenues to exploit people. It was really just agriculture, maybe some construction, and domestic work. Today, slaves can be exploited in dozens of industries linked to the global economy. The price of acquiring a slave has dropped dramatically. Around the world, 200 years ago, you could buy a slave for a global weighted average, roughly $5,000. Could be as high as $10,000 or $20,000 for a peak slave hand in Virginia, or some slaves were sold for the price of a cup of tea in Bengal. Average of around $5,000 in today's dollars. Today, you can buy a slave on average around the world for a little more than $400. So that is a 90% reduction in price. Now, some slaves today might sell for $5,000 or $10,000. Let's say a virgin sold in Western Europe, whose virginity is being auctioned off. But today, you can also buy a slave for $20 or $30. The average has dropped substantially. At the same time, the profits generated through slave exploitation have increased radically. So in the old world, your return on investment for buying that slave, or ROI, was around 15 or 20% per year. Again, agriculture was the main work they did, 1 or 2 harvests a year, limited opportunity to generate profit and income by exploiting slaves. Today, that return on investment is 300, 400, 500% or more. In the case of sex trafficking, it can exceed 1,000%. Right there, you have a very clear picture of why human trafficking and slavery have captured and captivated the interests of small-time criminals and organized crime groups around the world. It is tremendously compelling business with tons of money to make. As a consequence of some of these factors, another very important thing to bear in mind is slaves have become much more expendable, chewable, and discardable. If you spent a large sum of money and could only recoup it across many years, you wanted to care for that slave to some extent. There are many brutalities that would occur in the past, of course, but by and large, you wanted that slave for a lifetime. You wanted that slave to have children, and for them to become your slaves. Today, if you can spend a few $100s, make it back in a few months, or generate thousands of % return on investment in a few years, you can chew that person up until there is nothing left and get another slave to take their place. So people have become devalued as a result of the economic logic of slavery. Finally, one last point which I'll make because it leads into some of my other comments is in the past you could of course legally own other people. For most of human history, you could legally own other people. Now, the global slavery abolition movement started in England in the 18th century and then of course spread around the world here in 1865. That's our important date with the Emancipation Proclamation and 13th Amendment, when slavery is abolished here. So today you cannot legally own someone, but that doesn't mean they're not exploited in ways that are the same, if not worse. So this, if there's only one thing you remember, these comparisons and this new logic of slavery, I hope you will register in your mind. Now, I've already used a lot of terms: slavery, human trafficking, debt bondage, etc. And the truth of the matter is, some of these terms are still being worked out and still being defined, particularly in the context of international law. What is slavery today? How do we use that term? So the original kind of contemporary definition of slavery comes in a League of Nations convention from 1926. Again, legal rights of ownership no longer existed, so how do we define this term slavery? And kind of the concept that evolved starting in this convention was focused on the power that you exert over someone when you could legally own them. So exercising control and power over someone as if you could legally own them. And that's kind of an evolution and adaptation of the term slavery to modern terms, but it's really not quite capturing everything we see today and all the complexities and nuances of the term. So because these legal rights of ownership no longer exist, what is slavery today? Well, across the last several decades, these definitions have been worked out, and people have been trying to explore what it means. There's a general sense that it sort of means some coercion of involuntary labor or services. And for those of you who might be familiar with the International Labor Organization, or ILO, they have a convention on slavery, number 29, and this is kind of their concept: coercion of involuntary labor or services. Inherent in that is that someone's liberty has been restricted. They cannot move freely, and they cannot change their vocation freely. They have to do this work, and they cannot leave, and they're forced to do it. So that these concepts are kind of circling around this idea of slavery in the modern world. But how much coercion is required? How much restriction on liberty is required? These are the questions that sort of slavery scholars today are wrestling with, and they have huge implications on how do you identify slaves, how would you prosecute a case, and how many of these people are there? Obviously, if you are more liberal or broad with how you construe coercion, then you will have a larger number of people who would qualify as being slaves in the modern context. The narrower you are, or the more strict you are, the number will go down. In many circles, I just want to point out that the term forced labor has been used in place of the term slavery. Slavery, of course, historically associated with chattel slavery, owning people. So since that doesn't exist, some people have said, well, then we shouldn't use the word slavery. Let's use the word forced labor. So if you hear that word, that's sort of where it's coming from. Human trafficking, I've already used this word a few times. So what exactly does that mean? And I just want to get a baseline of clarity for you on some of these things. So this has added more complexity to the issue, this term human trafficking, which has kind of ascended in the last 14 or 15 years. What does it mean? Well, most definitions come out of something called the Palermo Protocol, which is a United Nations Convention protocol passed in the year 2000. And it has a long, boring, typical legalese definition that I won't trouble you with. But basically, there's three elements that are required for someone to be considered a victim of human trafficking. The first is someone has to be recruited, harbored, moved, obtained. It has to be done through force, fraud, or coercion. And it has to be done for the purpose of some sort of forced labor or servitude-like condition. So basically, where you see these three elements, you might call this person a victim of human trafficking. So Maria's story, she was fraudulently recruited. She was told she was going to work as a cleaning lady. She was then transported for the purpose of forced prostitution. So she would be a textbook human trafficking victim. Same with Mustafa. And same with Equiano. I just want to wrap up a few thoughts on this term slavery and then move into some examples of what it really looks like. This is really a struggle in contemporary scholarship on how to define this term because it has huge implications for everything from prosecutions to investigations to empowerment and protection. So is slavery this severe restriction of liberty and free movement and coercion of labor and services? Is it just some denial of humanity and the dignity of a person and exploiting them to advance your own economic interests? Somewhere in there is the definition of slavery, and it is crucial that internationally recognized and agreed upon definitions be created because the ability to prosecute offenders and protect victims is hinging on our clarity vis-a-vis this question. Last couple of thoughts really are from the practical standpoint. It's not just an academic exercise because real people are suffering every day. And sometimes academics get caught in their silos and worry about technicalities. But the fact of the matter is, the suffering is going on. And if we are very restrictive in how we construe slavery, then we are eliminating a lot of potential people who are suffering. And of course, if we are too broad, then we are losing the meaning of the term. So again, there's great importance in sort of setting the boundaries and lines on how this term is to be used. And this is a key component of a lot of the work I am doing at present. So what does it look like? Slavery. What's it like to go around and come face to face with slaves, to document them? Well, I want to go through a few examples so that you can really see and feel what this is like. So here's an example of some child slaves. These are Roma gypsies. Many of you have heard of them. They are a very, very minority, disenfranchised population in Eastern Europe primarily, but also in Western Europe. They live on the fringes of society, barely educated, have very little economic opportunity, and in many parts of Europe are deemed subhuman. Their children are often trafficked and exploited. In one case, or one quadrant of exploitation is forced begging. So these two Roma boys here were in the capital of Albania, Tirana. And I came across them, and they were being held by a slave master and forced to beg every day for his profit. They were sitting across the street from the US Embassy of Albania and several other embassies because they thought, the exploiters, people will have money in this area. The child on the ground, they had gashed open his head so that he would be bleeding to try to curry empathy from people walking by. And the fact of the matter was, there was very little empathy, very little intervention. Not many people were caring about these people. When I met with and documented sort of groups of these young Roma boys, they had an interesting term for themselves. The best translation of the term was they called themselves robots. And this is because they felt completely mindless and that they had become like automated robots. Wake up, beg, sleep. Wake up, beg, sleep. Don't think, don't talk, don't run away, don't do anything. And it was a horrific encounter. And even more horrific than that was the fact that there was very little intervention, very little care and awareness of them and what they were going through and what their people as minorities were going through in Europe. I'm going to talk more and more this evening about how slavery and trafficking is touching your life. Obviously, child slaves in the streets of Albania begging are probably not touching your life in a direct way unless you feel for them as another human being. But some slaves are very much touching your lives, like these right here. This is at a tea plantation in Bangladesh. And I can tell you all that tea is tea that we consume here every day. Major tea companies are buying that tea at major tea and coffee chains and in grocery stores. We consume it. I traced the supply chain. These slaves were kept in forced labor in tea plantations, working around the clock, 2 and 3 days without a break, without sleep, until they literally passed out on piles of leaves. What's even more frustrating about this story is these are all tea plantations in Bangladesh that were first set up by the British 160 years ago during colonial times. And the British, during colonial times, trafficked a huge number of Indians from the states of Orissa and Bengal to work as slaves in these tea plantations. And do you want to know what I found when I went to these tea plantations? Every single one of the people I documented traced their ancestry back to those people from Orissa and Bengal who had been trafficked by the British. Their descendants were still working as slaves, making tea that we consume every day. They could not leave these factories, they could not find anything else to do, and the world doesn't even know about them. It was a really startling encounter for me. And I want you to know that doing this research is not that easy. You can imagine places like this have guards with guns, who don't want people poking around in a 160-year-old slave narrative. Fortunately, tea plantations are very, very big, and they can't guard all of them all the time. They span tens of thousands of acres. So you can find your way in and start to speak with people and document what's going on. But this, for me, was a case study. When the disempowered and the exploited and the oppressed get no assistance or attention or empowerment, this is what happens. Generations go by and they're still enslaved. And I don't want that generations from now we will look back at today's trafficking victims and say their fourth descendants down are still being exploited as slaves. It would be a tremendous failure of our civilization if we were to let that happen. Chattel slavery, I told you about this idea of being able to legally own people and that it really doesn't exist anymore. Well, it doesn't, but sort of it does still too. And there are examples of this. If you go to Mauritania, you can not quite, but sort of legally own slaves. In parts of Nepal, you can legally own child domestic slaves. Not legally, not officially, but you can. It's called a kamlari system. And once again, like the Roma, like these tea workers, a disenfranchised, low-caste, impoverished ethnic group. So these young girls belong to a community called the Taru. And when they get to be about 8 or 9 years of age, they are recruited and put into domestic work in upper caste homes. And they do that work from the age of 8 to 18. They don't receive wages, but they get room and board, a little bit of food, maybe some gifts now and then. And they'll work 7 days a week, cooking, cleaning, etc. And in many cases, you can imagine young, pretty girls like this, what might happen to them in the home with the other men in that home. When they're 18, they're sent back to the village, and they're married, and they have kids, and the cycle continues. And this is sort of their fate. The challenging thing is, when I talked to some of the upper caste home members and said, what are your thoughts on this system, as the domestic slave was sitting there, they kind of stumped me because they said, well, this is better than the alternative. The alternative is those girls are going to be trafficked to India and forced to be prostitutes. And they're going to be attacked by 20 men a day. Here they have room and board, and they're safe, for the most part. This is better. And I was genuinely stumped for a moment, because yeah, on the face of it, that did sound better. But what I realized was, just because child servitude is better than child rape doesn't mean it's okay. It just means we're failing the children. And these children. And this conundrum is really at the heart of so many trafficking cases around the world. Many times you will be told, or I have been told, well, the alternative would be worse. And many times that's true. They're going to starve to death in a week. But the fact of the matter is, for any human being, in my mind, to face that devil's bargain between starving to death or being in immense suffering or having to enter some form of servitude to find security, this means we have failed as a civilization, all of us. And this situation, this devil's bargain, cannot exist in our world if it's going to be a decent and legitimate world. Bonded labor, it's the subject of my second book, and I often do entire lectures on this issue. I want to just give you the concept in short. This was a dominant mode of slavery around the world, everywhere in the world, for centuries. It's sort of born in feudal economic systems, where there's a small upper class landowning community, and then a huge plethora of disempowered peasants. So you see this in the systems of serfdom, peonage, throughout medieval Europe, throughout medieval Asia. And basically, the disempowered, low-class economic person has to exchange labor for credit or a place to live. And what happens is they take the loan, $50, $100, and because of the huge asymmetries in power, they're forced to work off that loan for years, for a lifetime. Might be passed on to their child, still trying to work off the debt. Just starting with a small loan for basic food, water, shelter, medicine. That system largely dissipated around the world as we transitioned to market economies, but it remained very much entrenched in South Asia because of the caste system and the immense amount of poverty. Now, you will find debt bondage everywhere. Maria's story was a debt bondage story. Work off the cartel money of crossing you over the border. Mustafa's story was a debt bondage story. I'll give you a loan for training and documents, you'll work it off. But it's really entrenched in South Asia. And this is one example, stone breaking. A very basic, rudimentary function. These are bluestones, granite, essential inputs into the entire construction industry. And these bonded slaves work for years, hammering away with an 18-kilogram metal hammer, bashing those huge boulders until they're tiny pebbles. They get paid 15, 20 cents a day because they're working off debts, and these are then used in construction projects. As much as possible, I have tried to do the work of the slaves I document because I want to feel what it's like. And so that's me there also breaking stones. I couldn't lift the hammer. And I'm actually a little more fit than those guys, but they managed to do it. I could barely lift it. And when I brought that hammer down onto the stone, I thought my shoulders were going to pop out of their sockets. And the thought of having to do it thousands of times to break that boulder down into rubble overwhelmed me. It was also 108 Fahrenheit that day, and just about every day. And so I was drenched in sweat, parched, feeling the suffering for just a moment of what their lives were like for years. I had water, but I wouldn't drink it because they didn't have water. And this is the narrative and the face and the daily detail of slavery around the world. And these people will work their lifetime away and ultimately die trying to break stones for construction projects. And by the way, I'll just finish up by saying this particular stone quarry was used in construction for buildings of major Western multinational corporations being built. This is not far outside of New Delhi. Companies that you would recognize, major tech companies. Child soldiers, another huge category of the exploitation of children. This was a child soldier in Nigeria. And he had been forced to work for a militia that was expressing a lot of violence about a legitimate issue, which is there is a huge amount of oil in Nigeria, and the money is going into the pockets of a handful of people, and the rest of the country is starving and suffering. And so some militias get violent about it. And all of that oil is going into a city called Port Harcourt on the Delta coast, in Delta State. And militias attack the pipelines, and they recruit boys to come and commit some of that violence. And he was a child soldier who had managed to get out of it, and I met him and his family in his village. The story he told me about what he went through was fairly horrific. Now that he had made it out, he was hopeful for some sort of better future. And he had received an offer to go to Western Europe and train in a developmental football league, soccer league. He's seen and heard about some of the African stars who make it into the European soccer leagues and make millions. And so what do traffickers do? They capitalize on that hope. They come in and see a young, fit boy like him and say, look, I can get you to Greece. There's a couple of developmental leagues there. You'll be the next star. I just need a little bit of money and a loan, and I'll get you there. And you can well imagine what happens to a lot of these boys once they're there. It's not becoming a football star. Children and sex trafficking, like Maria, like millions of others. I've documented too many of these. Too many. This is really a prototypical case. This is in northern Thailand, near a city called Chiang Rai, not far from the Burmese border. So this is what child sex trafficking looks like. On the bottom floor, you see some adult women waiting to give tourists their massage, foot massage and whatnot, Thai massage. It all looks fairly reasonable and legitimate. That woman in the blue top at the door, she runs the place. And if you're a young single male and you happen to walk by, she says, come here, let me show you. And she takes you up a flight of stairs, as she did me. And behind a locked door, there are young 10, 9, 11-year-old girls, just wearing little robes, and they're told to take them off. And the man will select the 1 or 2 or 3 that he might want. Well, I turned around and I left. I just couldn't stomach it. And on the way out, she was trying to entice me to transact with her. And she said, look, I'll give you 2 for the price of 1. And it's a really horrific encounter to see these young children in a situation like that. And guess what? They were hill tribe people, disenfranchised, can't get into school, don't even have birth certificates, completely exploitable, invisible to the state, but they can be exploited by tourists. And I will tell you that every single one of the tourists I saw walking, and there are rows of these places, by the way, they were all Europeans and Americans going in and out of these places, every last one of them. I want to talk a little bit about sex trafficking and organized crime also, because more than any other sector, aside from possibly organs and organ trafficking, sex trafficking has really been taken over and governed by organized crime, and it presents significant security risks to those of us around the world. This is sort of what it looks like. This is a street corner in Copenhagen, Denmark. These are 4 young girls from Eastern Europe that I spoke with and trafficked and documented. They were all human trafficking victims from Poland and Hungary, places like that. What's of interest is that during this street corner is owned by Romanian and East European organized crime groups. They've leased it from the local organized crime groups in Denmark, so they can put their women there and customers can come and transact. A couple of blocks over from here is where the Nigerians have their corner. What am I driving at? These organized crime groups are cooperating in very sophisticated ways with each other to move and transact, lease and sublease territory in order to generate these billions of dollars that are made by the sexual exploitation of women like this. If you go to other cities like Torino in northern Italy, it's not a geographic segmentation, but a temporal segmentation. So you can go to a street corner called Via Ormia near the Parco del Valentino, and during the day, the East European mafias have that area, and at night, the Africans have it, paying off the local mafias for those rights. Now, are we cooperating as well internationally to fight them? Do we get along? Do we have the shared definitions and investigation protocols and resources to tackle something like this? Not yet. I'm hoping that we will one day, but I just want to give you a sense of how sophisticated this movement and exploitation of people is, particularly when it comes to the sex industry. I want to touch just a minute on South Asia in particular when it comes to sex trafficking, because this region is home to more victims of sex trafficking than any other in the world. No one really knows how many there are. Could be millions. And this is what they look like. They come from Nepal, Bangladesh, and rural India into urban centers. A common theme of movement, rural into urban. Bombay, Delhi, Calcutta. This is Bombay, and there are some red light areas. I just want to show you what you're seeing here. The two girls on the right are two Nepalese victims of sex trafficking. The woman on the left is the brothel madam. The child over there is the child of not one of these two girls, but another girl who was a victim of sex trafficking, born in this context a few years earlier. They sit on the streets, and you'll see here there's a couple of curtains, right? These are called cages. The Hindi word translated as cage. And the women live in this. It's about 6 by 10. 2 or 3 of them live in one of these, and there's just a couple of dirty bunks. And you see a little curtain. Men go in, they transact, they come out. Men go in, they transact, they come out. Now, a lot of these men are local Indian consumers. A lot of them are from foreign countries. I've spent a lot of time in these areas. There are Americans who are going in there. There are West Europeans. There are Middle Easterners. There are Africans. There are Japanese businessmen who are going into these places. And it's just difficult to see this global consumption of young girls in these types of contexts, in the filth and the grime and the squalor of it all, and yet a system of thriving business to support the demand for it. This is something that I think will really drive home the point of how this issue is touching your life. I don't know if many of you have heard this term conflict mineral, but the long and the short of it is this. Just about every modern electronic device in the world, cell phone, laptop, digital camera, rechargeable battery, etc., has a few key minerals in it that go into the circuit boards and the rechargeable batteries. Tungsten, trillium, tin, tantalum. Half of those are coming out of one country, the Democratic Republic of Congo. Why is that? Because militias are warring, run the mines, and exploit child slaves. Do you see the little bit of a blue tint in the stones here that this child has just gathered from deep inside a tunnel? That's cobalt. And cobalt is in every lithium-ion rechargeable battery on the planet. The lithium-ion battery in the jet plane that you might fly on, as well as your iPhone, as well as your laptop. And again, half of the world's cobalt, if not more, is coming out of child slave mines in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. That touches our lives. Now, electronic companies know about it, but not much has really been done to tackle it because the pressure hasn't been there from consumers or government, for that matter. But billions are at stake, and the very fabric of our consumption habits are what is fueling and driving this phenomenon here. Construction, I talked about Mustafa and construction. Actually, this is Singapore, and these two guys here were at a shelter, and I documented them, and they were textbook trafficking for construction victims. And if you look at them, he's wearing a shirt that says England, he's got a cell phone, just looks like a normal fellow. Really looks like a normal fellow. In point of fact, this is what many trafficking victims look like. You wouldn't otherwise take a second look. But he had been trafficked from Bangladesh into Singapore, had been working for 1.5 years without pay, building beautiful big office buildings, and then was ultimately arrested for not having proper documents because they were never given to him, and was now in this shelter just to find some food to eat. This is a huge, huge component of modern human trafficking, the construction sector. You may have heard some of the stories about human trafficking for the World Cup construction in Qatar that's happening right now. Most of them are from Bangladesh, Nepal, South India. Exact stories like this. No one's really shining a light on it, so they're brought in, chewed up, do all the work, kicked out. The work gets done, the construction company makes money, kickbacks to government officials, and then we go to the sporting events, no fault of our own, and enjoy the events, but it's being built on their backs. I've mentioned organ trafficking a couple of times. I'm kind of going through all the faces of slavery and trafficking to give you a sense of how pervasive and broad and horrific this all is. And some of you might have said, wait a minute, organ trafficking, what does he mean by that? I get sex trafficking, I understand forced labor and construction and all that. What does he mean by organ trafficking? I don't think he means what I think he means. Well, I do. Organs are being ripped out of vulnerable migrants and put into transplant hospitals in the United States. I've done an extensive amount of investigation with the Department of Homeland Security and with the FBI along the South Texas-Mexico border, one of the most violent places in the world. And like Maria, there's a flow of migrants coming up to the border. And what happens when they get there is they fall into the hands of cartels, Zetas, Sinaloa, etc., that run the border. They own the border. And if you want to get across, you need their permission, you have to pay them, you have to do something for them. And in many cases, organs are pulled out as payment. Those organs then are trafficked into hospitals in South Texas, Dallas, Houston, McAllen, Galveston. And I've traced them all the way into the transplant wards. Or they're used in medical clinics south of the border, and transplant tourists, we go south to get our transplants done very quickly because there's a long waiting list here. If you have enough money, you can do that. Well, I spent a lot of time, as I said, trying to document how is this happening? It can't be happening, right? There's controls and rules, and how could this even occur? But it does. It does. There are enough loopholes that it does. So this is the Rio Grande. Mexico's on one side, South Texas is on the other. And at the time that I was doing the research, this little pathway here was a common route that was being used to traffic people and organs. Kidney will last 22, 24 hours if you keep it on ice. Just right here. Now it'll shift week to week, but when I was there, it was right here, not far from a place called Sullivan City, if you look at a map, which is in South Texas. They come up, and then you walk through what looks like that over there, enough brush and trees, and ultimately you get to a stash house, and then you're off to the hospital. Or if it's labor trafficking victims, the construction site, the stash house, what have you. And this research, I had to stop because it got too dangerous. For those of you familiar with this part of the country, all of the border towns on the Mexico side, Reynosa, Matamoros, Miguel Alemán, they have cartel lookouts. And when you cross the border, if you just walk across, there's always somebody looking out for a high-value target. So FBI will not cross the border. DHS will not cross the border. When I crossed the border, I had to take private security contractors, veterans from Afghanistan and Iraq, to go across with me just for the day. So they're lookouts looking for high-value targets, someone to kidnap and ransom, or someone asking questions. And I was going to stash houses and shelters and talking with people who had had kidneys taken out by cartels or been forced to go through these transplant procedures in clinics. And on my fourth foray, my security team, we always had a morning briefing, they said to me, Kara, we've got intel that you're on the list now. You've been asking questions, you're on the list. So we can go across, but it's going to cost you more, and we can't guarantee your safety. So I had to stop. One can only push so far, but others need to continue this work. And it's not just here. Organ trafficking is happening across Europe, in South Asia. The poor and the vulnerable are finding their way into these horrific situations, terrible situations, where they have to exchange a kidney for passage in the border, or money, or just under coercion. Seafood. We like seafood. We eat seafood. The US is the largest importer of just about every seafood commodity in the world, including shrimp, which is the largest seafood commodity in the world. Most of that shrimp is coming from East Asia. Most of that shrimp in East Asia is being made in circumstances involving child labor, human trafficking, and forced labor. This is Bangladesh, along the coast, not far from the coast. And the entire part of this country has been transformed into shrimp farms. And millions of people are working in servitude, harvesting shrimp. They first catch the baby shrimp, they put them into these farms, they grow, they take them out, then they process them, descale, devein, dehead, flash freeze, and ship. Almost all of it's coming to the US, a smaller amount to the EU and Japan. And I trace the entire supply chain, and in my second book I give the statistic, which is that roughly 1 out of 57 shrimp consumed in the United States can be traced to slave labor in Bangladesh alone. Bangladesh is a tiny player in the global shrimp market. So when you add in Thailand, Vietnam, China, that ratio is going to get much more worrying. But this is what it's like walking along through shrimp farms and meeting and documenting with slaves working in these industries in the far, far, far reaches of the world. I've mentioned Nigeria a couple of times, the child soldier, of course, Equiano and Badagry. And I want to talk to you for just a minute about this right here, because this was one of the most scary and challenging and dangerous aspects of human trafficking that I've ever researched. Going back a few years, I started meeting a lot of Nigerian girls, 15, 16, 17 years old, throughout Western Europe, London, Milan, Copenhagen, Munich. I started seeing them in East Asia, I started seeing them in North America. And they all told me these stories. I took the juju oath. We walked across the desert for a month or two till I got to the coast. We took a raft into Spain. I was sold to the madam, and then I was in one brothel after another across Europe. I was told I had to work off this debt, this huge debt, 50,000 euros. If I didn't, the juju priest would curse me. He would curse my unborn child. He would curse any child I'd ever had. My whole family's life, my eternal spirit would be damned. I sat in a couple of trials where some of these women who had escaped were told to testify against those who had exploited them. In fact, I was in the very first trial in Torino involving a Nigerian trafficking victim, and she came up to the stand, she was shivering, she was terrified, and the very first question was asked of her by the prosecutor, and she started to have a fit, and she went into a trance, and she couldn't talk, and the trial ended. She was in that much terror of the penalty that would come to her if she spoke about her ordeal. This was a kind of power and control I hadn't encountered before, and I needed to understand it. So it took me a few years to get the links and ties and security required to go to Nigeria, which I did, and I spent a month there a couple of years ago. I talked about the child soldier. I came across a baby factory. You may have seen this in the news recently. Women who are forced into getting pregnant, and then the children are sold into international adoption. I also went to the family members of some of these girls I had met. I had built a lot of trust with them because I kept coming back and meeting with them wherever they were. And I went into their villages in Benin State. They were all from Benin State. And they talked about a few juju priests, and then there was one main juju priest for all of Benin State, the spiritual advisor to the king of Benin State. And I thought, I'd really like to meet this person and understand what's happening. They're not supposed to talk about the ritual, but some of them had described it. It involves the priest taking their nail clippings, their hair, menstrual blood, putting it in a container, swearing them to an oath to repay their debt, don't go to the police, don't talk about this. If you get deported, go back until you've paid off your debt. Anyway, I got into these villages, and my driver happened to be someone who was taking girls now and then to the head priest to take this oath, which was, by the way, arranged entirely by the Nigerian mafia. This was a great way for them to control girls, and they were paying the head priest in exchange. So one young girl, the driver and I, got in a car, and we went deep into rural areas in Edo State. I have no idea where this really was, because we went for a couple of hours. Anyway, we were getting close, and the young girl who was with me, who said she would take me, started to get terrified. She said, look, I can't get any closer. I can't get any closer. Just leave me here. Leave me here, you go. It's not much further down. I needed her to tell me where it was, but she said, look, it's not much further down. So I left her literally by the side of a tree. She wouldn't go any further. And my driver and I continued on, and sure enough, we came across this shrine just in the middle of the jungle. I came out of the shrine, of the car, looked at the shrine, and some young children, this tall, ran out and started hissing at me. You're going to think this is a Hollywood movie, a bad Hollywood movie, but this was really happening. They started hissing at me. And my driver said just 2 words. He didn't speak much English. They speak pidgin English, so we couldn't communicate very well. He said, which children? Which children? I had no idea what that meant. I approached the shrine, and on the outside wall, there were probably 100 framed pictures of all these people he had cursed. And they were deformed, distended, grotesque. They had broken their oath. And he was showing you what happened when you broke your oath. I walked in a little further. My driver came with me. And I entered, and I saw that man there. And he was the head priest of Edo State. His name is God's Time. This was his shrine. This is where he administers, at that altar there, these oaths. You'll see on the ceiling some little framed mirrors. I had no idea what any of this was till later. You'll see a couple of guys in red over here, his priests. Well, he spoke very good English. You can't tell because of the perspective, but he was a very big man, probably 6'5", really big man. Imposing, intimidating. I walked into that place and I was terrified. I genuinely thought this guy could probably curse me. I don't know what's happening in this little piece of the world. I can't explain it, but I have a bad feeling. And I thought to myself, imagine I'm a young 15-year-old girl who can't even read or write, and I walk into this place and meet that man, and he puts me through an 8-hour ritual. I understood what was happening to all the girls I met. I understood why they were terrified. I had seen letters in his hand, on his letterhead, sent to girls at a Red Cross shelter. He knew where they were, warning them, don't speak. And then I was in front of him, and I realized, I know why they're afraid. I know why when they get deported, they come back. I felt it. It didn't make any rational sense, but I felt it. Well, I spoke with him for a few minutes. I said I was a tourist, interested in his culture, just wanted to talk about his religion, his rituals. We spoke for a little while, and I've done this long enough that I can kind of sniff out and sense when someone's starting to get suspicious. And believe me, most people are pretty good at hiding when they're getting suspicious. But there's a couple of, you pick it up. So I could tell when he was getting suspicious. More of these red-robed guys started filing in the room. He started asking me where I was staying. Could he send someone to bring me back tomorrow and see one of his rituals? I said, yes, of course. I knew it was time for me to leave. So I left him a large donation, and I told him, yep, I'm staying at this village. I would be honored if you would send someone to bring me back tomorrow. That village was 100 kilometers away from where I was really staying. And I got out. And I didn't really need to understand or see anymore. I really understood then. Now later, some people back in Benin City, I talked to them about this and the things I saw. And I said, what were all these photos? They said, yeah, that's what he does to the cursed people. And I said, these children, they hissed at me. What was that? Those are the children of the cursed people. They're witches. They have devil spirit in them. What about the mirrors on the ceiling that I saw? He has demons in them. And if you break your oath, he releases one of them. You might say to yourself, how do we even begin to tackle something like this? Isn't this also just an extremity, an anomaly? And I want you to understand, yes, this is at the margins, but the cultural forces that put people in a feeling of being coerced are present. It could be a sense of duty. It could be a sense of, this is the fate for my people. I'm a Roma. I'm a low caste. This is what's my only opportunity. And it could be taking an oath in front of this man. But there are forces at play that coerce people and pressure them and push them into doing these things. And when you meet them and say, well, were you doing this by choice? And they say yes, many times that's the end of the conversation and they're not classified as a trafficking victim. One of the facets of my work is to expand awareness of what coercion really looks like in the modern world. It's not chains in slave ships. It's things like this and encounters like this that really help you understand when we're talking about an immense portion of the planet that does not have access to education and literacy and has cultural norms that are hard to understand. This is what we have to face and tackle vis-a-vis human trafficking and some of the faces of trafficking and slavery. So those are some of the faces of slaves today, some of the forces, some of the places I've been, and some of what I've seen and wanted to bring to you. If I put my academic hat back on for just a minute, I want to round up by just giving you a 20,000-foot view of, again, what is driving all of this from the global economic standpoint? What are the supply and demand forces that are promoting this? Because if we can understand these forces, I think we can tackle them better. So, supply. What is it that feeds into the supply of vulnerable people? Well, through these examples, you probably have a pretty good sense. It's poverty. It's economic disenfranchisement. It's minority status. It's being a female. It's corruption and lawlessness. It's all of these things that make people imminently and perpetually desperate and vulnerable. And our inability to address these issues on a sustained and significant basis is what is ensuring that there are 1 or 2 billion people at any given time that are always on the verge of something terrible happening to them, the worst of which might be being enslaved and exploited. But what about demand? I've talked a little bit about this, and this is really where we come in. So every slave industry is going to have a slightly different facet of demand, but there are always 2 components of demand that drive every transaction for a slave and every slave being exploited anywhere in the world. And that is the exploiter's demand to maximize his profit and our demand, you, me, and everyone we know, our demand to pay less for things, to get things as cheaply as possible. So, how does this work? How does our demand fuel into slavery? Well, on the business side, for any business, labor throughout history has tended to be one of the most expensive components to operating costs. So throughout history, producers have naturally tried to figure out how do we minimize or eliminate these pesky labor costs, having to pay people to do work. Slavery is the extreme of this. Let's pay them nothing, or almost nothing. Well, no one wants to work for nothing, so we'll have to force them. That's slavery, basically, in a nutshell. If you can strip out labor costs, you drastically reduce the costs of running your business, and you do a couple of things. 1, you make your business more profitable. Or 2, you can lower the price of whatever it is you're selling to be more competitive. How are the prices of things determined? Well, by the costs of producing and manufacturing and distributing and marketing them, by and large. If you take out labor, the costs have gone down, and you could sell that thing for a little bit less and still make money. Be price competitive. This element right there is the fundamental economic difference between Old World slavery and New World slavery, this globalization of price competition, or competition in general. So in a globalized economy, in our economy, in this point in history, where products are available from all over the world right here in front of us in our stores and shops on any given day, slavery has transformed from the old world, or evolved from the old world into the new world, as one of the chief ways that unscrupulous producers can lower operating costs in order to find balance, their desire to boost profit, and be price competitive. And so you've got iPhones not manufactured here, but in China. In some cases at Foxconn plants My children are people working 20 hours a day. You've got apparel for Gap, not made here, but in Bangladesh, where working conditions are horrific and people are paid 10 cents a day, etc., etc. The goods might be a little less to us, profits to Gap, Apple, etc., a little more. That's the globalization of competition. That's where human trafficking and slavery have evolved and insinuated themselves in the global economy. So, some of the products, I've already talked about them, whose supply chains, meaning the entire production chain, that I have documented as being tainted by slavery and child labor are frozen shrimp, tea and coffee, agricultural products, granite and limestone on your countertops and bathrooms, apparel, sporting goods, the conflict minerals I told you about, palm oil, and hand-woven carpets. I'm going to use hand-woven carpets as a very quick case study to show you what does this kind of supply chain issue look like? What does child labor and slavery in a supply chain mean, and how does it touch our lives? And I've recently published a report, which you can get online for free through the Harvard School of Public Health website called Tainted Carpets. And I'd encourage you to download it and read it. And I started with this one as a series of commodity projects that I want to do, because for me, these carpets, and by that I mean the little rugs we have in our sitting rooms and offices that are woven by hand, they bring into focus one essential thesis of modern slavery and human trafficking, and that is the suffering of children and slaves transforms into the beautiful things we buy every day, that we like to buy, that we adorn our homes with. It's that transformation that is at the essence of slavery today. So what does it look like? How many of you have handmade carpets in your home? Most of you probably do, right? Maybe not the big, really, really expensive ones, all of us, but we all tend to have some of some kind. This is how they're made. This is a handmade carpet loom. You'll see 2 horizontal rods and hundreds of vertical cords. People sit down on that bench and take a piece of yarn and go in and out of these cords all the way across, 1 yarn at a time. It's painstaking work. It takes weeks and months to make some of the big carpets by hand. I deployed a team of researchers, including myself, across northern India, the largest exporter of these carpets. We are the largest importer, to document conclusively the conditions that were being used to make these carpets and trace those carpets all the way to retail sale here in the United States at companies like Macy's, Bloomingdale's, Target, Sears, IKEA, Crate & Barrel, Williams-Sonoma, and many others. Every carpet you see here is sold in those stores. So this is just what the loom looks like. These are the tools that are used. That claw is used to drag the yarn down those cords. You'll trim with the scissors, and there's a blunt object used to pack down the yarn so it's nice and thick. A lot of these looms are in people's huts, thousands of them spread across Asia, and they look just like this: cramped, dark, dusty, hot, humid, sold at beautiful showrooms here. But these are where they're made. The conditions are quite horrific. So the ailments these people suffer, never mind exploitation, spinal deformation, muscle atrophy, vision ailment, respiratory ailment, cuts, etc. When they're exploited as slaves and child slaves, then the conditions are even worse. So you'll see thousands of huts like this with little carpet looms just sitting there and people working 18 hours a day weaving these carpets for sale to us. What you also see is factories like this with a brick wall up front. No one can get in. Guards, locked door. Well, what's behind that? What's behind that is something like this: workers locked inside as slaves. They sit at the carpet loom all day. They move a few feet over and they sleep on a plank of wood under a mosquito net at night. They go back to the carpet loom, they come back to the bed. There were people here who had been trafficked from Nepal. This factory exports carpets to Williams-Sonoma. They had been in there for months, hadn't been paid. They get food, but not much more than that. Or you see something like this. This was a shack in rural India, and the shacks that have children in them are a little more heavily guarded. Many times, myself and the researchers were turned away violently by guards. We were roughed up, had a couple of vehicles completely destroyed. Guards get angry when you poke around. When children are involved, they get especially protective because they know that's really a no-no. So we have to do stakeouts. We monitor security patterns, and when we know the guards aren't there, most of the times they just have big sticks and metal pipes. Sometimes they have guns. When we know they're not there, we go in. Inside this shack, we saw more than a dozen boys. Some of them were still asleep. It's very early in the morning. Some of them were up and already at their looms weaving the carpets. Held in servitude. Recruited by agents and desperate parents. Here was another one that we managed to get into. Locked gate with children inside. It took us a couple of days to get access. The children bathe in this little mold-infested pool of water here, and then they weave carpets all day. The previous shack in this one linked to Macy's and Bloomingdale's. And if there's any doubt where these carpets are going, this one made it pretty clear. So, what were the findings of this report, right? This comprehensive study across the entire industry and the supply chain of carpets. Well, we found that about 45% of the workers were in some form of forced labor. About 20%, no, bare minimum 20% were children. And I say that because for every child we were able to document, there was 5 shacks where we saw children and we were beaten away and couldn't document them. So there are many more than we were able to document. We captured the production sites of about 95% of the export market, 172 different exporters, responsible for 95% of carpet exports from India and just about every import into the United States. On average, people were making 21 cents an hour. You saw what this work involves. And for carpets that are sold for thousands of dollars or tens of thousands of dollars, imagine 21 cents working 12 or 14 hours a day, leave alone under slave-like conditions. 99.9% of the cases we documented were low-caste individuals. This has been a recurring theme tonight, hasn't it? Muslims, which are low-class or minority in India, and groups called scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, and other backward classes. These are kind of political terms used to identify outcast people. 99.9%. The workers were from age 8 to 80, and they worked 10 to 12 hours, 6 to 7 days a week. And those production sites, as I said, were linked to this list, among many others, of major retailers. Now, it's not our fault if we buy one of these carpets. We didn't know any better. Those companies might be getting some assurance downstream, no child labor here, everything's fine. But that certification is worthless. What's really happening is what you find when you go deep in and conduct the research. And so the next series of projects I'm going to do is take this model and go commodity by commodity. And just last week, the second part of the model is I take these findings and I met all day with the Department of Labor, the Department of Justice, State Department, USAID, the International Labor Organization to create a carpet protocol that we will take to industry and say, these are the things you have to do to make sure these problems aren't happening, and we're sure that you'd like to do them. So just my final thoughts, and I probably went way over my time, and I'm sorry, but as you can tell, I just have so much I want to talk about and share with you on this subject. Just a few concluding thoughts, having gone through this supply chain discussion with you and how these issues are touching your life. Go back to Badagry and that comparison. It's evident slavery and human trafficking are centuries old. But they are far more profitable and far more intimately and intricately woven into the global economy than ever before. This means that human trafficking and slavery is inevitably touching our lives, even when it's occurring on the far side of the planet. But rest assured, there is something happening closer than that as well. if it's not clear, the need for research. Young people, perk up for a minute, please. You need to go out and take your energy and add it to the immense research dearth. We need you out there doing research, learning, documenting, and bringing back your findings and bringing back the voices of these people so that we can keep having evenings like this all over the country, all over the world, until there's enough people who say, no more, not on my watch. Which leads to my final thought, which is there is tremendous space for new leadership on this issue. The field is begging for leaders with the integrity and the discipline and the ethic to go out and do this work and contribute in whatever way works for you. My final thought this evening, you remember that young girl I told you about in Nigeria when we went in the car and she just couldn't go any further. Nigerians have really interesting names. Her name was Peace. Her sister's name was Joy, and her mother's name was Grace. Beautiful names that belie a horrific condition that they live in. Anyway, Peace, we made our way back and went back to her village, and we sat down, and I sat with her family, and Peace was really shaken up. And so she was talking to me a little more about what she had been through. She had just taken that juju oath the previous week and was getting ready to head to Europe, even though her sister said, please don't come. But the conditions where they were living were so horrific. She felt she had no choice. So she told me more about her story. And in fact, it was only then that I learned she had already been trafficked. Her sister didn't tell me that. She had been trafficked to Europe and deported and was trying to get back to pay off her debt. And she was feeling really helpless. I could see she was struggling with this. And at the end of her story, she was just filled with tears, and she looked at me with piercing, piercing eyes, blood-red, piercing eyes. And she said, do you really care about me? Does anyone really care about people like me? And I didn't know what to say. I really didn't know what to say. I knew at some level I cared, but I knew what she was driving at. What was I going to do about it? Was I just going to come back and tell her story? What was I really going to do about it so that she didn't have to go back again and again? So I pose this question to you. And I think the answer has to be obvious. We all must care about people like Peace. If our world is going to be decent and sustainable and legitimate and just and good, we have to care about people like Peace. It's very pressing that far more effective efforts be undertaken to address the suffering of the millions of men, women, and children who have been exploited in horrific brutality as slaves all over the world each and every day, the millions of them. And this must be done. It must be done for them. It must be done for Peace. It must be done for us and our souls. Because it is fundamentally in the shadows of inaction and apathy that atrocities are committed. And my humble plea to all of you is that we all find a way, try to find some way to be active and to shine a light on this offense and contribute in whatever way you can for us and for them. Thank you.
I think we will not do questions. We'll give you a break.
I'm happy to do questions. I'm really happy to do questions.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to ask if you would once again please thank our speaker tonight, Professor Siddharth Kara from Harvard University. For those of you who have an interest in his work, 2 of his books have now been published. He is working on the 3rd, and a feature film is currently in production based on his first book. These are available for purchase here, and if you would like the opportunity to meet him personally and to greet him since he's here for just this evening, you're welcome to do so. Thank you so much for being here tonight, and for those of you who'd like to meet him, he'll be up in the South Concourse at this corner. Thank you very much.